Taking the stage is William Malik, VP of Infrastructure Strategies at Trend Micro. Bill will be presenting Small Step or Giant Leap, Cyber and Policy Progress Towards Satellite Security.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Since I'm the last one between us and drinks, we'll try and make this not go too long. In the course of this talk, we're going to have three sections. First, we're going to talk about satellites, which is the cool, fun part of the talk, and one of my two favorite charts is in there. There are two important charts in this, and the first one is going to be on the communication systems between the Hubble and the ground station, because when you see the complexity of that, you'll understand the problem that shows up in the second part of the talk, which is the amazing range of vulnerabilities in satellite systems as we have them today. The third part of the talk, we'll talk about what we can do to solve the problem. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end. If there's something burning and urgent and you can make yourself seen over these incredibly bright lights, I will do my best to respond to them. So first, a little bit of history of satellites, and I love this part. 1957, Sputnik went up, scared the hell out of the US and a lot of the rest of the world. This satellite was only up for 3 months. It orbited the Earth after about 90 minutes, and it broadcast at 20 megahertz and at 40 megahertz, and it sent out a beep that lasted 0.3 of a second. The beeps were timed to tell whoever was listening the pressure and temperature inside of that satellite, which is about 22 inches across. The antennas were 7.5 feet and 9.5 feet long. You could see it at night. I can remember standing outside when I was just a wee tot with my dad and mom looking up and seeing a Soviet satellite. Kicked off the whole initial pulse towards STEM education. The next thing that went up was Echo 1. This was an interesting satellite because it's basically a balloon. It's an aluminum sphere filled with gas caused by a chunk of material that's slowly gasified inside the thing. We learned from this that there was a thing called the solar wind because it was being pushed around a lot. The idea behind Echo 1 was that we'd bounce radio signals off of it. So it was like a reflector up there, a way for us to transmit EM beyond the horizon. That was the second stab at the sky. Then came Telstar a couple years later. The circles in the center on the equator of this thing are actually hyperbolic horns, which are used for transmitting and receiving telephony. So this was actually used to send signals across areas under its footprint. It was fairly high up, so there was actually a phone conversation between the United States and Britain to signal that this was going on. Very interesting and fun satellite. Then came Skylab. Anybody remember John Belushi? Here comes Skylab. It was up there for a few years. From this, we learned about the Van Allen radiation belts, and we learned about what it takes to live in space. We put this up there. People lived up there for months. 84 days was the longest duration of somebody living in space. It looks lopsided because the heat shield had to be stretched sideways. The other solar panel didn't deploy when the thing was up there, but redundant systems and good engineering design meant that it was still habitable and useful for a number of months. Skylab helped us understand what it means to be in space as citizens of space. Then came Voyager 1. This is my favorite of all the things out there, and to be honest, it's not a satellite because it's not orbiting anything. It's just out there. It is now 22 hours away by EM signal. If you want to set up an SSL handshake with Voyager 1, it'll take you a week just to get the information back and forth. And by the way, the device itself has 3 computers with an aggregate processing power of 0.17 MIPS. So we're not talking about a lot of horsepower out there. They recently figured out how to make the battery, which is that thing at the top. It's actually a cylinder with a decaying radioactive element, and the heat drives electrical power. So it should last for another 3 or 4 years. It's been up there since '77, and it's going to make it maybe to 50 years. These are the kinds of orbits that satellites live in around the Earth. The HEO isn't to scale. That's a highly elliptical orbit where it goes way out into space and comes back. The geosync orbit stays in the same place because it's 22,000 miles up. So the rate at which it rotates around the Earth is the same as the rate at which the Earth itself turns. So the satellite appears to be at the same place in space, really useful for durable communication. However, because it is 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface, remember an EM signal goes 198 miles in a millisecond. So there is a significant delay. We are not going to use geosync orbits for anything having to do with 5G or subsequent forms of telephony. For those, you need a satellite that is closer, low Earth orbit, under a couple hundred miles. And even there, you're talking about milliseconds of delay. And when you're in a low orbit, you move really fast, which means the satellite is only available in line of sight for 5 or 6 minutes out of each orbit. So in order to have a communications network that's relatively crisp, you need to have a lot of satellites. That's why we see Starlink and the others putting up hundreds and hundreds of satellites, so there's always somebody to talk to. And the satellites not only talk to the ground, but they talk to each other to hand off signals and so on. It's kind of like when you're on your cell phone and you're driving, except you're standing still and it's the base stations that are driving by. MEO is the medium Earth orbit. That's higher up. It's good for things like Hubble, where you're a couple hundred miles higher than the low Earth orbit, and it's relatively uncluttered. And we'll get into that next. Hubble's actually my favorite. I really like this satellite. It went up and it had a vision problem, so they went up and they fixed it. Very smart satellite. The door on the front is to protect the mirror from being directly hit by sunlight because that would burn out the optics. There are two antennas, two pairs of antennas on it. On the end of the stalks are very powerful directional antennas, and that's how they do the relatively high band stuff. And then there are two smaller antennas. One of them's clipped at the bottom, but you can see that white thing that looks like a Dixie cup. That's the broadband lower spectrum, lower bandwidth antenna, and that's used for signaling and direction. Now, moving this thing is an interesting problem. There are no rockets or jets on that because its job is to look at space, and if it had some kind of propulsion system, it would produce a cloud of dust, which would travel around it and obscure its vision. The way they change the direction of this thing is they have reaction engines. How many of you ever played with a gyroscope when you were a kid? You spin a gyroscope and you got it up there and you try turning it and it pushes back. There are 3 gyroscopes in the Hubble. When they want to change its position, they speed them up and then they try to push against them in one way, and the result is it moves the satellite in the other way. Very clever engineering. Thing's been up there a while, it's still working, it's got a couple years left. And this is what it takes to support the Hubble. When the Hubble makes an observation a few hundred miles up, it passes the information off to this tracking and distribution relay. Now, if you know space people, you know how tempting it is for them to refer to that as the TARDIS, and they do. But anyway, that thing takes the data from Hubble and then beams it down to Earth. It's traveling, there are actually a series of those, and they communicate with ground stations. So the Hubble makes an observation, sends it up to the TARDIS sends it down to the ground station, and then it goes to one of 3 sites where it's analyzed. For comparison, the Webb is 1 million miles away. The Webb telescope is 4 times farther from Earth than the Moon. This thing is a couple hundred miles away. So Webb is a much, much different process, but it uses the same links to get the information back to the Earth. And I mentioned this network of ground stations. Here they are. There's roughly a dozen of them. And the point of these is that there is a satellite in geosync, so 21,000 miles up, that talks to the Hubble, tells it where to move next, and then beams information down. There are 3 locations on the Earth that pick that stuff up, one in Maryland, one out in, I think it's Guam. The point is that this is a rather complex network. So in sum, this is what the TARDIS does. This is a really complex piece of gear. It's a beautiful satellite. Solar panels for power, space-based ground links, high frequency, 3 frequency stuff, Single-axis antenna, multiple-axis, omnidirectional. The thing's got redundant systems on top of redundant systems. It's going to be up there for a long, long time. They're now into third generation of TARDIS. So what's the story with satellites today? Well, this is what we use them for. We use them to talk to each other. They talk to themselves. We use them to look at what's going on the planet. We use satellites to figure out what the weather's going to be like. We use satellites to figure out if there is an agricultural problem. They can detect changes in foliage to tell us if there is some kind of a disease or a pest infestation. They're also used, obviously, for military purposes to figure out where the bad guys are, where our guys are, and so on. And we use them for science, taking a look out there and seeing what out there has to tell us. Simplifying the design from Hubble and generalizing it, this is what a satellite network looks like. You have ground stations for the purpose of getting data from the satellites. You have other ground stations for the purpose of telling the satellite what to look at next. And you have the satellite itself with all of its multiband connectivity. Now, for illustrative purposes, the links that are vulnerable to hacking are shown in this diagram in gray and black. Everything's vulnerable. And the sad news is, I gave a version of this talk 4 years ago at RSA, and it's only gotten worse. So here are the unintentional threats to satellites, the thing that can go bad because things go bad. You can have people attacking the ground stations and the data links. You can have satellites attacking other satellites. The command and control networks are so vulnerable. Now, there is an unintentional threat which isn't described on this chart, but which became extremely relevant the month after that talk, and that is that GPS satellites, the first generation of them, had a 10-bit counter to count the number of weeks from the beginning of time. Now, if you're a Unix person, you know the beginning of time is January 1980. And if you've worked with binary much, you know that 10 bits gets you to 1024. Now, quick question, if there are 52 weeks in a year, and you can get to 10,024, guess what happens after about 19 years and 6 months? The counter rolls over. So the counter rolled over in August of '99, and nobody really cared, because there wasn't much using it. The counter rolled over again in April of 2019. 14 aircraft of the 767 and 77 variety were grounded because the pilots noticed when powering up the system that it said today's date is August 1999. And if you're a pilot, you rely on the instrumentation to tell you things like how fast you're going, what direction you're going, how high you are above, and what the time is. And if the console is telling you that it is 20 years ago, that is a good reason to ground that plane. So 14 planes were grounded. In the city of New York, their city-free Wi-Fi was down for a week because it also was tied to a GPS satellite that had the 10-bit defect in it. Also, in New York, they have automated systems to run the traffic signals based on the volume of cars on the road. That was also knocked out. So they fell back to a standard, 60 seconds on, 30 seconds green, 15 seconds of yellow, and so on, causing a certain amount of deterioration. Also, the New York City police couldn't run plates because that communication system was also tied to this. So how did they fix it? They reset the baseline for the counters. And different satellite operators did it at different times, which means in approximately 16 or so years, we're going to start seeing failures again in some of these older satellites. Nobody knew they would last that long when they put them up, but they're pretty durable. So bad things can happen to satellites on the ground and on space, and bad things can happen when satellites interact with satellites. In 1978, an astrophysicist named Kessler said, gee, there's a lot of stuff up there. This is a picture from 3 years ago. Each one of those dots is a satellite. They're all moving at about 18,000 miles an hour, and some of them get pretty close. There have been some near misses. There have been a couple of collisions, which, as you now know, will generate a tremendous amount of space junk to the point there are now some bands that are not habitable for satellites. In fact, they had to move the International Space Station up 100 miles because there was junk in its flight path as well. We track that junk. There is actually a site in the notes which tells you what the known pieces of junk are. There's one site that tracks stuff that's 10 centimeters or larger, and that site follows about 20,000 items. There's another one that's classified that tracks stuff that is half a centimeter larger, and that system has about 50,000 items that they're willing to tell us about. So Kessler syndrome is where a satellite hits another satellite, which causes debris, which then hits other satellites. And if you're familiar with nuclear physics, we call that a chain reaction. So we're concerned about Kessler syndrome, and so our solution is to send up thousands more satellites, but make them smaller. Odd. These are the intentional threats. This is when somebody decides they're going to try to take out a satellite. I'm not talking about unintentional things like bad luck or dumb design. I'm talking about somebody actually wanting to knock something out and cause trouble. This is from a report that was issued by NASA about 8 years ago. The kinds of things that can happen to satellites include jamming, which means blocking what's going to or from the satellite to keep it from sending information. Eavesdropping is listening to stuff. Hijacking is taking over the satellite. The first hijack was for satellite TV in the 1990s, where somebody took over a satellite putting pay TV down in the Florida area and put porn on the channel. Not very clever, but it raised the point. And then we also have attacks against ground station and attempts to overwhelm it. There are ways to counter these things, and I'll talk about those in a second. But the point is, it's just out there. It's a relay. Satellites are thought of from an engineering perspective as just a bent pipe. You get a signal coming in here, you send it down there. Communication satellites have one job. They don't even interpret the data. They just forward it on. So in terms of control takeovers, my favorite one was in '99 when some hackers contacted the British government and said that they had taken over one of the British government's military satellites. And the British government actually called its satellites Skynet. But the bad guys said, we're going to take over the satellite unless you pay us this ransom. And then a couple of months later, the Times of London reported that, no, that never happened. None of that took place. All references to it were scrubbed from the UK press. You can still find a few if you dig around. A friend of mine, when I was at Gartner in the 90s, was at a conference at the Naval Weapons School, and he met a gentleman from British intelligence, and he asked him if he knew anything about the backstory. What happened to the hackers who tried to blackmail the UK government by hijacking a satellite? And the gentleman from British military intelligence said, they went away. Due process, you know. When it's a military thing, you don't do that. And then in 2000, French intelligence agencies started messing with the GPS satellites, interfering with some US and British war games in Greece. That's just intramural sport. The Russians did the same thing off Ukraine in 2016, and now we have it happening again in Ukraine, and we also have it happening in Israel, where Hamas is now seeing bad data when it comes to trying to aim using GPS. They're sending bad signals. During the aftermath of 9/11, GPS signals globally were shifted. I was in Australia for a conference, and a fellow there who was a seaplane pilot told me that the folks who would fly out to the Great Barrier Reef would end up 50 miles off course because the GPS satellites were being detuned so they could not be used reliably. More recently, this paper is from a PhD researcher. It was presented in part at Black Hat earlier this year. He identified vulnerabilities in existing satellites. He found easy ways to take over OPSAT, to take over ES code, and the Spark-based systems. The point is these systems are designed to be cheap and inexpensive and easy, and they don't have spare bandwidth for things like generating secure messages, validating codes, checking passwords, none of that stuff. There's no PKI mechanism in this. These are built for speed, and they're lightweight, and they're very simple, and they do not have spare bandwidth, they do not have spare memory, and they do not have spare CPU processing power. So they're very, very fragile. The paper is called Space Odyssey, an experimental software security analysis satellites, IEEE Symposium on Security, and the reference and URL are in the references at the end. So what do we do about it? Well, some advice. There are threat-specific things. You can put anti-jamming capabilities in place. This is spectrum hopping, the same thing that Heidi Lamar developed in order to protect communications with torpedoes by the US Navy in World War II. You hop frequencies, you can't jam, right? Hardening against shielding, requiring authentication from GPS signals. You get a signal that says this is the date and the time. Say, well, how do I know you are who you say you are? How do I know you're not a phony satellite? Well, there's a mechanisms in place. You can put an embedded security processor. In fact, the current generation of IoT chips from Intel, from ARM, from many others actually have a segmented secure processing capability for the sole purpose of being able to handle things like patches, encryption, digital signatures, supporting authentication, and so on. Finally, we have strategic measures, systemic things. We want to deploy orchestrated security. We want real-time anomaly detection, and the way you do that is you gather intel from these using that secure processor. The messages aren't big. We're not talking about logging all the traffic. We're just talking about logging anomalous requests, broken packets, and the second one, this is one of the great things. I had a conversation on Mastodon just a few days ago with a gentleman about ISO 7498. We all know ISO 7498, right? That's the OSI reference model. What you probably don't know is that 7498-2 applies 5 fundamental security principles to the OSI reference model, and they are authentication, that is, how do you prove you are who you say you are, authorization, meaning now we know who you are, what can you do, encryption, meaning keeping the data safe, keeping the data from being altered. It's not encrypted, but it's got some sort of a detection code on it. And finally, non-repudiation, which is more of a legal concept than a cybersecurity one, says that if I send you a message form 1, I can't deny having sent it, or if I send you a message form 2, you can't deny having received it. Well, these are the kinds of things that we can put out there in general. We want to make sure that there's better logging that can be done on the ground side, and we want to make sure that we have a cybersecurity framework that will help us do this. And guess what? There is one. NIST just published this a couple of months ago. It's the, apologize for the initials, it's the Hybrid Security Network Cybersecurity Framework. And if you've done any work with cybersecurity frameworks, this is a pretty good one. These are the categories. And for each one of these, it allows you to take a look at your program and to say, what are we doing about identification? What are we doing about detection? What are we doing about response? What are we doing about recovery? I mean, this is basically a 21st century version of the good old BS 7799 standard from about 30 years ago. Now, if you travel around information security circle, you'll find there are a lot of people who helped develop BS 7799. In reality, the number of people who came up with it would fit in a phone booth. In fact, they had a big argument about whether or not recovery, disaster recovery, should even be in the security standard. Some of them said this is the last chance saloon. If you've already required to go to that, then your security measures have failed. So we said, no, we should probably tell people to do something about recovery and continuity of operations. Fortunately, those cooler heads won out. Use this, again, there's a link to it. It's NIST. Off the top of my head, I don't have the number on here. But the point is this will help you validate, and please doing it during the design phase, validate the security capabilities and integrity of your program. Now, at Black Hat recently, there were a couple of presentations. There was one that talked about how easy it is to hack stuff in low Earth orbit. And just a few months ago, the US Air Force hosted a hackathon for satellites. And that's a picture of one of the winning teams. That was the satellite. It's not much bigger than a shoebox. And the point was to take over the satellite and demonstrate your success by having it take a picture of something on Earth. A lot of people won. It is very easy to do. These systems are simple, they are fragile, they are brittle, the protocols are not mature, and satellites are just big IoT devices. They're just a little harder to service than some of the other ones. So in the long term, look at satellites as just another communication link. Use comprehensive security, multiple layers across your environment. Embed security and privacy design. The previous speaker had a wonderful set of charts at the very beginning that talked about the value of security by design, that talked about how you can protect yourself against this during the design phase. As with quality, as with safety, you can't put it in after the birds of flight, okay? You got to do it in from the beginning. Look at software architecture as a potential set of problems. Not because people are malicious, but because this stuff is hard. It's helpful to have a lot of people looking at it, people from different backgrounds, people with different perspectives. When I was a cub programmer at IBM in the early 80s, I went to my first code walkthrough. I worked on storage management for the mainframe OS. And there were 8 people around the table. And I did a quick calculation, and I realized I was looking at about 120 years of expertise in coding for that environment. And the appropriate attitude is humility. You can learn a lot if you check your ego at the door. And that's got to be the way this stuff is done. If you rely on a brilliant individual to come up with a great design, it'll be impenetrable, it'll be unfixable, it'll be undocumented, and it'll be useless, especially when it's 22 hours away by EM signal. You want to have lots and lots of people nod their heads and say, yep, that'll work. Run capture the flags. Make sure you pay attention to standards and regulations. I was the person who raised my hand and said, yeah, we need more regulation, right? If automobile safety were left up to the manufacturers and were made a recommendation, we'd have seatbelts on the Abrams tank and on U.S. Postal Service vehicles, and we'd have 60,000 more deaths on the road a year in the U.S. Regulations got us there. So, the costs are plummeting. Moore's Law is still working for satellites. Even antennas are getting cheaper. What that means is the bad guys can develop kit to take over a satellite for less than $750. And that's even in a world that doesn't have Radio Shack anymore. I mean, it's real easy to do this. The attack surface is widening. We're putting more sophisticated stuff up there. And here's a message that's not on the chart because I've been told not to say this too much. There is no IT-OT convergence. They are diverging. Every year we're getting more and more bizarre and different forms of computerization for signaling and actuating in more and more bizarre and absurd places. If you are waiting for convergence to solve your IT-OT security problem, you are waiting for a train that is never going to come. Think about how you're going to bring stuff in there. Whatever convergence is happening at the systems management layers, where we're seeing convergence of the requirements for performance, for problem determination, for capacity planning, for security, for authentication, for authorization, for data integrity, for confidentiality, and for non-repudiation. That's where the convergence is taking place. Not because everybody's going to run an ARM or an Intel processor or a Motorola processor with one instruction set. It's getting more diverse. Be aware of what you're going to be using your satellites for. Think about what the vulnerabilities are, and when you do the risk assessment, bring in somebody from outside, because sometimes the stuff you think is valuable ain't really, and sometimes the stuff you think is cheap or not worthy of attack turns out to be hugely valuable. I consulted with a private sports organization that keeps records of folks who play this game. I won't tell you which game, but it involves a ball. And the people who play this game give over their personal information for this organization to track their score. I'm not going to say handicap, that would tip it off. To track their score, right? And because people give it to them voluntarily, they didn't really pay much attention to the value of that database. But think about all the people who play a game involving a ball, and think about what occupations those people have. They are presidents. They are premiers, they are senators, they are CEOs, and their data, up until a few years ago, was in a database that was not encrypted or protected. And because this organization got it for free, they didn't think it was that important. If satellites have a role in 5G, it'll be for backhaul and for fringe. I promised in the description of this session that I would mention blockchain. Blockchain has no value in solving the security problem for satellites or anything else. The commercial instantiations of blockchain, and I spoke with a fellow at Verizon who is responsible for the product, they're wide open and subject to a 51% attack. What does that mean? That means if we're all on a blockchain for our corporation, all I need to do is to get 10 more people to come on board and they can take over the function. So how does the vendor solve the problem? They make it a permissioned blockchain, which means only a preordained set of people can modify the contents of the blockchain. Well, now let's stop and think of it. If I've got a preordained set of people that can modify the contents of a blockchain, and a blockchain is a ledger, can't I do that with an Excel spreadsheet on Google Docs? Yes, without burning down the forests of Sweden to power it. Blockchain has no commercial value in any security instance that I have ever seen. We do require greater regulation. Let us just hope that it is smart. I promised a set of references. I will be happy to give you a copy of the material, and we also have it posted up. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll take any questions. Go ahead.
So in my control system, we read data from a GPS, right? And eventually that's going to come from some kind of satellite. So should I be considering that an untrusted network connection? Is it possible for that to compromise my control system if I don't have some kind of protection in place?
Basic GPS is not protected. There are a new generation of GPS with an alternate protocol, which will allow you to authenticate the source of the material. But for the time being, if you are making critical decisions based on GPS-based information, you should have a backup plan. Captain of a ship in the Black Sea noticed that his GPS told him that he was on course, but he was actually at that moment 20 miles inland. So the captain turned off the GPS, and he used the same reckoning that every captain has used on every ship since, you know, the Polynesians were finding their way to Easter Island looking at the stars and the horizon. So yeah, do not believe what you see from a GPS. I mean, it's not as bad as stuff you find on the internet generally, but it's close. It's not Wikipedia, which is a faith-based encyclopedia, but it's close. If you're relying on GPS, find an alternate channel to validate it or use the advanced protocols that are coming out.
Okay, thank you.
2 questions.
Sure.
First question, is there an international governing body that determines how Earth orbit is used by satellites?
There are a number of organizations that parcel out orbits, and they try to coordinate as best they can, but right now geopolitical forces are making it so that they don't really play nice together all the time. So you sort of have to figure out which camp you want to align and conform with. There's the US GPS, I'm trying to remember the name of the European one, and the Chinese and the Russians are each setting up theirs as well. So there are a couple of different ones up there. What you need to do is pick the one you're going to be involved with, get into that program, and then be very careful to be aware of incursions from parallel bodies with other backers.
And the second question is really a sci-fi question. I mean, is there such thing as a weaponized satellite?
Is there such a thing as a weaponized satellite?
Yes.
There are three kinds of weaponized satellites. There are the simple kinetic satellites where you drive it into another satellite. There are satellites that can use pulse, EMP weapons, to disable satellites within a certain domain. And there are satellites that can fire high-power lasers. The latter, those of you who are students of history, remember in the early 80s, it was called Star Wars. That was the Reagan initiative to try to shoot down missiles as they were being launched from space. The details on how far along those programs are classified, but I can think of no reason to believe that there are not such capabilities overhead right now. I know there are conventions and treaties saying nobody would ever do that, but I have relatives on my mother's side who are Native Americans, and so they know the value of treaties.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
So I work in offshore drilling, and those platforms connect to the outside world via satellite, right? And right now, those satellite connections have low bandwidth, and they're terribly unreliable. They drop out all the time.
Yeah.
My question was, do you foresee that connectivity getting better over time, or is this kind of just a it is what it is situation?
Well, that's the goal. The problem is how do you improve the connectivity for satellite communications? And the solution that most people have landed on is put up a lot of satellites. So if the signal, that one's bad, you can use that one, or this one's coming into view in a minute. Right? So they orbit typically at low Earth, it's going to be like 90 minutes to 120 minutes, and they're overhead for 3 to 5 minutes at a time. So you put up, 1,000 of them, which means at any point in time, there's going to be a handful that are within line of sight from where you are. And if there's a tree limb here, you'll get it over there. You broadcast to all of them. You get a response from all of them. It's kind of like, basic internet communications. You send the packet every which way, and it gets reflected and bounced back, and hopefully it gets assembled in the right order at the other end. But yeah, that's the only strategy we have right now. Again, power is at a premium. So you can't really add the wattage to these things. I mean, Voyager, with 22 hours away, I guess that's like 14 billion miles. That's got a 250 watt power source, and not all of it goes to broadcast. So it is really, really faint. You have to have a big antenna to hear it. Larger antenna can help. Dish found that out when they went from a 12-inch to a 16-inch antenna, that the reception went up rather significantly. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes? Oh, cleaning the debris. Very, very interesting topic. Thank you for bringing it up. There are a couple of programs. There is actually a satellite program that NASA's working on to send up satellites which can do a couple of things. One program is to have the satellite attach itself to dormant satellites and then steer them into the atmosphere. A second one is to put up a satellite that will spread out, think of it as a net, and it'll try and scoop up debris over some path, and then it'll send that into the atmosphere where this stuff burns up just like meteorites do. So yeah, there are programs to try to clean it up, but you put that into the valiant efforts like trying to clean the ocean up. It's like, too bad we didn't think about this 30 years ago, right? But yeah, it's an initiative, and it is getting some traction, especially for bigger, heavier satellites that would cause a lot of debris if they got hit by something. Yeah. I think I have a reference to that too. Anything else? It's Miller time. Thanks.
The fun isn't over yet. Join us for our party at South City Kitchen. Enjoy sophisticated Southern cuisine and cocktails while you celebrate the end of another successful day at the ICS Cybersecurity Conference. The reception begins at 6 p.m. and is a short walk down Peachtree Road. Your badge is your ticket in. See you there.